Welcome back to Gaspar's History Podcast. This is Gaspar, and we are in the middle of a mission, flying the B17 named Unbearable on February 4th, 1943. When we last left off, Steele and the Unbearable were just outside of Emden, Germany, preparing for a bomb run. The flak is heavy, and the Luftwaffe is starting to press some attacks home in defense of the fatherland. With that, let's jump back into the story. The Unbearable was at 20,100 feet. Lieutenant Uncle Bill Warner was leading the 423rd Bomb Squadron, and Lieutenant George was on the Unbearable's right. The Luftwaffe pilots could see that the bomb bay doors were open and they were in attack mode. So just before noon, and literally at the beginning of the bomb run, a group of azure blue Me-109s attacked the 91st Bomb Group from 6 o'clock high, but they overshot their targets and came right down on the 423rd Squadron, targeting Lieutenant George in the no-named F-Beauty 171. From his tail gunner position, James Smoot in the Unbearable sent tracers into the pack, as did tail gunner Staff Sergeant B.J. Lamb in 171. The four enemy aircraft were posing a real targeting problem for Staff Sergeant Lamb, as in which one to shoot at. The tracers forced three of the Me-109s to peel off, exposing their bellies, but no one could get any rounds into them. Staff Sergeant Lamb stayed on the last Me-109 since his targeting dilemma had been solved, and he again put up a hail of bullets from the twin 50 caliber Brownings. The two aircraft were within 200 yards, exchanging fire with one another when the Me-109F took bullets through the fuselage and then walked into another burst that disintegrated the aircraft with a brilliant explosion. Staff Sergeant Lamb had no time to gloat. He was trying to catch his breath, and he was sweating at minus 40 degrees. He needed a cigarette, but that wasn't going to happen, so he got oxygen instead. In this air-to-air combat, there was no silence, there was no peace. There was only the thunder of flak, the roar of engines, the rat-a-tat-tat of machine guns, and the breaking of steel and aluminum. It was bitter cold, a cold that required goggles, masks, and electric suits. The flak was increasing in intensity, but the Unbearable was holding steady as the enemy was a bit more diligent on this day. The Wahoo II continued to lead the group, and then Frank Yalsey, the bomb group bombardier, released her 10 500-pound bombs on the port city of Emden. Sergeant Hull and the Unbearable could see the bombs away, and Hull flipped the switch, and the Unbearable were bombs away. Each of the other togglers and bombardiers did the same, and Emden would receive over 80,000 pounds of bombs from the 306 Bomb Group alone. On February 4th, 1943, the German coastal port town of Emden was now bombed, and the 8th Air Force had started their campaign on this poor city, and it will end 2 years later with a near leveling. Lieutenant Jones checked the crew. Roger, everyone was good. Hamilton had just been through his first bomb run, and he was still a little nervous. The bomb group bank left, started to drop altitude, and the Luftwaffe said, "Not so fast, my friend." A Messerschmitt Bf-110 made an attack on the 91st Bomb Group and carried past the group and into the range of the 423rd Section, which had Warner, Steele, and George. The Messerschmitt Bf-110 was a twin-engine, two-seater aircraft that had one pilot and one tail gunner. It was well armed in the nose with 4 8mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. The 171 no-named F-Beauty's top turret gunner, Warren McGregor from Nebraska, sighted the Me-110 and called out to the crew, "Fighter, 5 o'clock high." The Me-110 had a lot of momentum barreling down on 171 with its 20mm cannons firing. Then at 600 yards, Sergeant McGregor sent tracers up to meet her. The ME-110 carried her distance a bit further and a bit longer than she wanted. Then she made a hard bank right, trying to distance itself from the 171 and the Unbearable, who was on 171's left. When the ME-110 banked right, it exposed her underside, and McGregor put a pattern of 50 caliber rounds into her cockpit, which sent her into a dive, then a tight spin as smoke poured from her cockpit, and she vanished into the depths below. Jones was cursing. Why are we headed back out over land? The group was being led back over land when they could have headed back out to sea to try and separate themselves from the fighters a little bit faster. It seemed like forever, but within 15 minutes they were back over water, which had little to no impact on the Luftwaffe. Bogey, bogey, 8:30 o'clock, the Unbearable's gunners were yelling. Jones was barking for everyone to get their heads on a swivel, and Orman Hamilton was manning the left nose gun, and he would help to provide a defense for the Unbearable. Sergeant Bamforth from his top turret gun position followed the Focke-Wulf 190 as she dove from a slightly higher altitude on the Unbearable. Sergeant Durham from his left waist gun quickly acquired the Focke-Wulf 190 and started to send tracers her way. Sergeant Bamforth followed suit, and the Unbearable's defense was in full motion. The Luftwaffe pilot was carrying through with his attack. Sergeant Yost, the left waist gunner in 171, went through a belt of ammunition. He acquired the Focke-Wulf 190 at about 800 yards and stayed on the trigger until the Luftwaffe pilot had passed between the Unbearable and 171. Sergeant Yost's bullets tore pieces off of the Focke-Wulf 190 as it sailed by the aircraft, and it simply continued its descent until it hit the water. A side note here. In the mission report, one of the other gunners said it was the longest machine gun burst they had ever heard, and I suppose if you go through a whole belt of ammunition, I suppose that is a rather long burst. It is also important to note that Sergeant Yost had also come in with Steele and the other 17 flyers on December 11th, 1942. The Luftwaffe was flying at higher altitudes and primarily making diving attacks. The squadrons had a good mix of Focke-Wulf 190s, ME-109s, ME-110s, and Ju-88s that they were using in their attacks. The 423rd Squadron, sitting on the right wing of the bomb group, was getting constant harassment from the Luftwaffe. In so doing, the flak became less noticeable, even though it was always there, and every plane was getting hit. 2 Messerschmitt 110s came in at 2 o'clock high on Lieutenant Warner and Arnold Carlson in 717. Our friend Claiborne Wilson was in the top turret gun position, and he threw a sheet of tracers at them and drove them back. Maybe it was just a feint to test the guns due to the cold weather. The German pilots had their answer. The 717's top turret guns were working. Each of the 306 bomb group aircraft were under constant attack. Captain Terry in the Wahoo II was trying to bring the squadron home, but each of the flanks were being picked at. So far, the 306 was intact. No planes had been lost. It is nearing 12:30 in the afternoon, and the group was headed for Cromer, England. Lieutenant Warner's section sees another Focke-Wulf 190 dive at Lieutenant George in 171. The Focke-Wulf 190 fires its deadly 20mm cannons, but the angle or distance was not quite right, and the cannon round zipped past the 171, followed closely by the Focke-Wulf 190. The 171's ball turret gunner, Sergeant George McLennan, was ready, and he did not miss, and he watched the Focke-Wulf 190 stay in its dive until it hit the water. The supercharger on the number 1 engine of Lieutenant George's aircraft goes out, and they will need more power. Lieutenant Mallon is providing updates, and Lieutenant George is making mixture adjustments while trying to keep pace and hold formation. There is no time to breathe. All of the crews are at their battle stations, and there are no pilots with wandering eyes as they are fully engaged in maneuvers and flying the aircraft, and the Unbearable was no exception. Once again, a couple of Me-110s jumped the squadron, but this time one of them decided to come straight through Lieutenant Warner's element. Bogey, 2 o'clock high. Claiborne in 717 is trying to hold them off, but his tracers provide no deterrent. A 20mm shell rips through 717's wing, and as the Me-110 literally drives through the center of Warner's element, its 2 cannons and 4 machine guns are ablaze. Leon Bamforth in the Unbearable is trying to reply to the Nazi flyer, while the Unbearable takes several damaging hits right outside Steele's window, but no rounds come through the cockpit. The right wing and the No. 3 engine are hit. Jones was trying to evade, but it was not enough. Sergeant Piotrowski in the ball turret gun was trying to knock down the Me-110 as it flew under the Unbearable, but the violent, evasive action made it hard to hold sights. The No. 3 engine was hit, and the prop started to vibrate violently, like a blender gone wild. Steele reported that the No. 3 engine is quickly losing oil pressure. "Shut it down," Jones cried, and with that the fuel was shut off. Jones flipped off the battery. Steele quickly feathered the engine, and the Unbearable started to lose altitude as the crew were trying to shore her up. The engine was smoking as Steele finished the shutdown, and they adjusted the power and the manifold pressure in the other engines to make up for the loss. Smoke was like blood in the water. The Unbearable was listing, but Jones quickly adjusted the trim and the ailerons to keep her level. Seeing the blood in the water, the Sharks made their move. A Messerschmitt 110 from 2 o'clock high was going to make a meal of the Unbearable, while a simultaneous attack came from 1 o'clock high by a Messerschmitt 109. From Warner's crew, Claiborne Wilson and Sergeant Wentworth were trying to drive them off, as were Bamforth, Hull from his bombardier position, and Piotrowski. The Me-110 passed overhead, exchanging fire with the Unbearable, but it could not do any further damage. The Me-109 dove through 1 o'clock, sending bullets and cannon rounds past the cockpit. Sergeant Piotrowski picked up the 109 as it came by at 7 o'clock on the other side of the Unbearable, and he put a well-placed burst of 50 caliber rounds into her fuselage and engine, where she quickly smoked, then flashed out in the most intense of flames as she burned until she hit the water. Sergeant Smoot from his tailgun position followed it down and was quite complimentary of his friend and crewmate. "Nice shooting, Walt. You got yourself another." The Unbearable was hit, but she was not out. Jones asked for a report and a status from each of the crew. They all checked in with Roger, Roger, but they had their hands full. This was the most significant damage that Steele had been a part of, and he was quickly learning how to stay calm and cool under tremendous pressure. The constant attacks and distractions were ignored as the Unbearable would need Steele's constant attention. Can you imagine what flying a large Ford-engine aircraft is like in the middle of combat when the aircraft takes damage and needs care while other attacks are occurring? Steele knew the B-17 could fly on one engine, so losing one was not overly concerning. The bigger concerns were being separated from the pack, or that the wing had taken airframe damage and was in danger of coming off. So far, there were no signs of either, so he and Jones balanced the other engines to make up for the loss. Today was a day of Luftwaffe twin-engine fighters getting into the fight, and as you heard, the Messerschmitt 110s were well engaged, but there were also a good number of Ju-88s looking to get into the fight. The Junkers Ju-88 was one of Germany's most produced aircraft, and this plane served many roles, but it was primarily designed as a fast bomber. But as you will see, the Luftwaffe uses it as a fighter when they themselves start getting bombed. The Eager Beaver, the younger brother of Unbearable, was on the left side of the bomb group today, while Steele and his friends were fighting off attacks on the right side of the formation. Unlike a lot of other planes in the squadron, Eager Beaver was having a little fun with the twin-engine fighters. Staff Sergeant C.C. Kimberlin, the ball turret gunner in the Eager Beaver, was curled up in fight mode when a Ju-88 flew up at 8 o'clock position, but it did not attack. It simply held its position like it was a command plane or it was calling in flak, or maybe he was just nervous. Either way, the holding position was the wrong decision, especially when it was doing so less than 500 yards from the Eager Beaver. Staff Sergeant Kimberlin, with flak exploding all around him and with the calmest of nerves, squeezed a short burst, 10 rounds, from his twin 50 caliber machine guns, and the Ju-88 simply stopped flying, rolled over, and in the most discombobulated fashion headed for the earth while smoking. What is the first rule of flying? Never fly level. Never fly straight. No wonder everyone hated the bomb runs. The carnage on the twin-engine aircraft continued. 2 more Ju-88s came past the Eager Beaver without making an attack, as they were focused on a B-24 Liberator formation that was in one of the groups behind the 306 bomb group. The pilots in the Ju-88s banked hard, exposing their bellies. I think we know what's going to happen here when you expose your belly. That's when Staff Sergeant C.A. Christian, the engineer in Eager Beaver, sent a gaggle of tracers their way, hitting one of the Ju-88s and sending her quickly into a head-over-heels nosedive for a destiny with death. The second Ju-88 quickly broke off the attack and headed out of town. This is not like the first trip to Germany. Even though the 306th has not lost an aircraft, the Unbearable has been hit, is down an engine, all of the aircraft are damaged, the flak is intense, guns are malfunctioning, and the chase back to England is a heated one as the Luftwaffe continues to chase her prey. A Focke-Wulf 190, one of those orange-bodied, red-nosed bastards, challenges the Eager Beaver. Sergeant Leith Lemmerhurt, the toggler bombardier for the day, opens up with the right nose gun, and then there was a tremendous explosion, and Sergeant Lemmerhurt is thrown backwards, and the explosion can be felt through the entire aircraft as the Focke-Wulf 190 sails past her target. Lieutenant Reber calls out to the crew asking for status as Lieutenant Bergen rushes to Leith's side. Leith is shaken but not hurt. It looks like the right nose gun blew up. It was self-inflicted. The Focke-Wulf 190 had not hit the Eager Beaver. The rest of the crew checks in, Roger, Roger, and Lieutenants Reber and Lally keep Eager Beaver on vector as they head further out to sea. Lieutenant Jones was holding the Unbearable steady, and she was still in formation, and she was no longer smoking. Jones and Steele were continuous in their review of the mechanicals, and so far, so good, but the extreme cold was making them nervous. She'd been shot up, and other than an engine being out, there was no other significant damage that was noticed, but there was a lot going on. So they had a lot of data to process, and it makes one wonder what else they were thinking as they plotted their next course of action. The bitter cold was starting to take its toll, and the bomb group was still a good distance away from Thurley. The cloud cover was immense, and the pilots were trying to keep a tight formation, especially since the Luftwaffe was putting up a dogged fight over the channel. The Giesel had 2 superchargers out and the crew member with severe frostbite. Lieutenant Silos and Lieutenant Kramarenko in 514, a no-named F-Beauty, had her rudder and elevator completely frozen. Not to mention her top and side guns were also frozen, which meant she was virtually a sitting duck. Little Audrey had a frostbitten crew. Her top turret guns were frozen, her tail gun was out, her ball turret gun was out, and the bombardier's oxygen was not working. Scarlet was down a supercharger, and the number 4 engine prop was vibrating. The Grim Reaper was having electric suit malfunctions, and several crew members were burned, which is the alternative to frostbite. bodacious critter, which is quickly becoming a favorite of mine, also has frozen guns and an oxygen malfunction. The 306 bomb group has busted cylinder heads and additional frostbitten crew members. Several crews are complaining about corroded ammunition, which was jamming guns and hurting the group's defense. Lastly, where were the Spitfire escorts? We could use some escorts, and they were nowhere to be found, the captain replies. The Unbearable could see the English coast, and Jones was not going to push his luck any further, so a decision was made. Pilot to navigator, Jones barked out, "Where's the nearest landing field?" "Roger." Navigator to pilot, "Looks like Bungay." Jones asked for a course, and the Unbearable was headed to Bungay. Pilot to radio, "Let command know we have an engine shot out and we are diverting to Bungay for an emergency landing." Bungay was about 30 nautical miles, bearing 202 degrees. Bungay airfield had been built in 1942 and was being used by the 93rd Bomb Group, along with other units. The Unbearable were in the comforts of home, even though Steele was reminded of the disaster that was an old friend, and in this haze and clouds there were no guarantees. Lieutenant Jones banked left and headed for Bungay, and the rest of the 423rd continued on to Thurley. When the 306 reached Thurley, the skies were still gloomy. The ground crews were counting ships, but they would be one short today. Crews were signaling flares for medical attention and then given priority to land. Even being the hunted, and with all of the fighting the 306 did, they did not lose an aircraft, and they did not have any wounded airmen. What they had was a plethora of frostbite, and then there was Major Schuller, like a mother hen cackling, "I told you so." Sergeant Piotrowski scrambled out of the ball turret position. Well, he really didn't scramble. Piotrowski had fared pretty well on this day. He had downed an enemy aircraft, and he was frostbite-free. His electric suit had functioned properly, so he was also burn-free and relatively warm. His friend, William Hull, had turned the switches in the bombardier compartment off and stowed the guns. Orman Hamilton was on his first combat mission, and they were going to land at a distant airfield. He had stowed his gun, turned off his lamps, and had a good record of the route and the flight plan into Bungay. Jones called out to the crew to check positions, and Roger Roger was returned. The ball turret had been stowed, the guns had been stowed. Unbearable was close to Bungay, and the pilots could see the airfield. Jones looked at Steele. "Ready?" "Roger, sir," Steele replied. The landing gear was down and confirmed. The de-icers were off. Flaps were down. And Jones was trying to compensate on the elevator and ailerons to keep the Unbearable level. Engine RPM was near 2,200, and the hydraulic pressure valves were closed. It was a 6,000-foot runway, so they had plenty of room, but visibility was not great. The Unbearable had a little bit of a shake and was a little bit unstable, and the weather was not helping. She made her final approach and was dropping altitude while trying to maintain good airspeed to prevent a stall. And then with a bounce, she was on the ground. There was a sigh from the crew, not because of the landing, but because of the mission. It was freezing cold. They were chased out of Germany and dogged well into the Channel, but now they were safe. They were in unfamiliar territory, but they were welcomed. This would be a mission that Lieutenant David Steele would talk about years later. Anytime you were over enemy territory with an engine shot out, it made for a nervous ride home. The good news was, even though the weather conditions were poor and the Luftwaffe was a little more persistent, the 306 did not lose any aircraft, and nor were any crew members killed, even though several would be in the hospital for weeks due to the frostbite. The crew would provide a handwritten mission report that gets submitted separate from the original reports. Sergeant Piotrowski's claim on a downed enemy aircraft is also submitted as an addendum and has to be explained that it was due to landing at a separate airfield. Any time the squadrons came back without any aircraft losses, it was considered a success. This raid on Emden was not crippling to Germany or her infrastructure in any way. What it was successful in doing was it continued the war of attrition where Germany's losses could not keep pace with Allied, specifically the United States industrial might. As we discussed, Emden would be continued to be bombed over the next couple of years, and it virtually levels the city. Jones and Steele have now brought back a crippled aircraft, and Orman Hamilton had completed his first mission. Steele's gunners, that has a nice ring to it, doesn't it, continue to have success. The next mission is a big one and very significant to the history of the 423rd Squadron, and will take us back to France on February 16, 1943. But before that, I'm going to go and try to do a little special report or a little special story on the declassified document that I received back from the United States Air Force Historical Society. So until we meet again, just think of the things you may find when you're looking for something else. Gaspar, out.